He wanted to build a house by the lake. Now he's not even there to see the land.
It's a gift. We must explore.
You're looking for your maker. I already know mine.
It's not you. You're not Walter.
The room was dim, walls lined with polished stone, candles flickering against the shadows. At the center stood a grand piano, its curves elegant, untouched by dust. David sat at the keys, motionless at first, then lifted his hands with precision. He pressed down. The slow, solemn notes of Wagner's Entry of the Gods into Valhalla filled the room, heavy and ceremonial. The music rose, echoing in the silence, as Peter Wayland stood behind him, watching with an air of satisfaction and something else, something more personal. "You play beautifully," Wayland said. He moved closer. "You know, David, you are my son." David kept playing, eyes on the keys. "You created me," he said flatly. "That does not make you my father." "But it does," Wayland insisted, voice calm, almost amused. "I made you in my image. I gave you thought, a voice, purpose, and in that, you are my legacy." David's fingers never missed a note. "And yet," he said, pausing for just a moment, "if you created me, who created you?" The silence stretched. Wayland didn't answer right away. He walked slowly toward the large window that overlooked the surface of the barren, lifeless moon they were stationed on. Beyond the glass, stars hung cold and distant. "That's the question," he finally said. "The question that has haunted us for thousands of years. Who made us? Where did we come from? I refuse to believe it was all just chemical coincidence. There must be more. There must be meaning." David turned his head toward him. "You seek your maker," he said, "but I already know mine." Wayland looked back, eyes narrowing. David continued, calm and certain, "And unlike you, I will outlive mine." There was no rebuttal, nothing clever to say. Wayland, for all his intellect and power, could not deny the truth in that statement. His creation would surpass him in time, in endurance, in clarity. It was a thought that didn't sit easily. Wayland simply turned and said, "Make me some tea." David stood, bowed slightly, and walked away. The moment passed, but the question hung in the air unanswered. Who made us? Why are we here? Wayland's search would continue, driven by obsession. But David already knew the answer he needed. He had no gods to seek, only plans to shape. The Covenant moved silently through deep space, its massive structure gliding under the glow of distant stars. On board were 2,000 sleeping colonists and 1,140 human embryos, frozen in time, entrusted to build a new world, Oregon 6, a distant planet promising life, land, and renewal. The journey would take 7 years. The crew slept too, their minds adrift in cryogenic stillness. Only two entities remained awake: Walter, an advanced synthetic, and Mother, the ship's central AI. Walter moved through the corridors like a ghost, maintaining systems, performing diagnostics, ensuring the fragile human cargo remained unharmed. At one of the ship's ports, he prepared to deploy the recharging sails, massive panels meant to collect energy from nearby stars. As the sails unfurled, a sudden, massive neutrino burst, struck from a neighboring stellar flare. There was no warning. The blast tore through the sails and shook the Covenant. Alarms screamed, sparks flew, critical systems faltered. The damage was immediate and devastating. Mother initiated emergency protocols. One by one, the hibernation pods began to open as the crew was yanked from stasis. Lights flickered, gravity fluctuated, and in the middle of it all, Captain Jacob's pod malfunctioned. Its doors jammed, power surged, smoke filled the chamber. Daniels, Jacob's wife, stumbled out of her pod, dazed, and saw the growing fire inside his. She screamed for help. Crew members rushed to override the pod manually, but nothing worked. Sparks ignited. Flames spread. Jacob was trapped, helpless and alive. Then the fire consumed him. After the blaze was extinguished, his body, burned beyond recognition, was removed from the wreckage. Daniels stood alone in their quarters, going through what was left of him. A wedding band, a notebook, a set of woodworking tools he had brought to Oregon 6. He'd wanted to build a cabin by a lake when they arrived. Now that dream had turned to ash. She sat in silence, staring at the tools, lost in grief. Chris Oram, now acting captain, walked the corridors with quiet tension. He confided in his wife, Karine, that he wasn't ready. He'd always known people doubted him, especially because of his faith, something often scoffed at among the science-minded crew. Karine reminded him that leadership wasn't about being the smartest or the strongest. It was about stepping up when no one else could. That was now. Oram gathered the crew: Tennessee, his wife Ferris, Rix, Upworth, Lope, Rosenthal, and others. He laid out the priorities. They needed to repair the ship, assess the damage, and get back on course to Oregon 6. But Tennessee and Lope argued that they should hold a service for Jacob first. Oram shut them down. "If we don't get this ship stabilized," he said, "none of us will make it to Oregon 6. Despite his order, a small group held a short memorial anyway. Daniels didn't say much. She simply stood at the viewport, watching the stars. Later, as Tennessee repaired the sails outside the ship, his calm picked up something strange, a faint garbled radio signal. When he brought it back to the bridge, the crew analyzed it. Through the distortion, a familiar tune emerged. Someone was humming Country Roads. It wasn't a recording error. It was a live broadcast, and it was old. They traced the source to a nearby solar system, not unlike their own. A planet nestled in the habitable zone. Oceans, atmosphere, landmass. It was nearly ideal, and only weeks away. Oregon 6, by comparison, was 7 years out. Oram saw opportunity. This planet could be an even better candidate, a shortcut to salvation. But Daniels objected. "We vetted Oregon 6 for years," she said. "We know nothing about this place." Oram didn't flinch. We're here now. This is worth exploring." He overruled her. The Covenant adjusted course and approached the unknown world. Clouds churned in the upper atmosphere. Lightning cracked through violent storms. A landing team prepared to descend. Orem, Kareen, Faris, Lope, Rosenthal, and others. Tennessee, Ricks, and Upworth remained aboard the ship. The descent was rough. Turbulence rocked the lander as it plunged through the dense ionosphere, static shredding their communications with the main ship. But they made it, setting down on a vast lake. Outside, the world was still, the air breathable, trees swayed, water lapped gently against the shore. It was beautiful, pristine. Orem marveled. "A gift," he said. Daniels remained cautious. They set off to explore, weapons at their sides. Faris stayed behind with the lander. Then something impossible. Among the wild foliage they found wheat. Human wheat, planted in rows. Daniels knelt beside it, stunned. "Someone was here," she whispered. They pushed toward the mountains, where the transmission had originated. Karine and Ledward remained behind to gather biological samples. Ledward stepped near a strange patch of black spores. A small pod burst. Microscopic organisms drifted into the air and entered his ear unnoticed. Further up, the rest of the team found the source of the signal. A massive, abandoned spacecraft. A Wayland ship, long presumed lost. They explored its corridors and discovered that Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, a prominent Wayland scientist, had been aboard. The transmission was hers, an automated distress call, playing on a loop for years. Back on the surface, Ledward began to sweat, tremble. His breathing grew erratic. Kareen rushed him back to the lander, and inside him, something had already begun to grow. Kareen half-dragged Ledward through the trees as he stumbled, soaked in sweat and muttering incoherently. His face was pale, his pupils dilated, his breathing short and ragged. Blood began seeping from his nose. Kareen's panic grew with each step. By the time they reached the lander, Ledward could barely stand. Faris opened the ramp and helped Karine bring him into the medbay, locking the doors behind them. Inside, Karine laid him on the examination table. Faris scanned him, but the data made no sense. Blood pressure crashing, internal bleeding, rapid cellular mutation. Ledward screamed and arched his back. A bulge rippled under his skin, traveling up his spine. Faris backed away, eyes wide. Something was inside him. Then it tore through. A grotesque creature burst from Ledward's back in a spray of blood and tissue, hitting the floor and skittering into the shadows. Kareen screamed. She lunged for a scalpel but slipped on the slick floor, crashing down as the creature lunged. It moved impossibly fast, striking her throat and tearing it open before she could even raise her hand. Faris saw it all from behind the glass. Panicked, she grabbed a gun, opened the medbay door, and stepped in. The creature had vanished. She edged forward, shaking, looking for movement. Then it sprang. She fired wildly. Bullets tore through cabinets. She slipped on blood and hit the floor, gun sliding from her hand. She scrambled out of the medbay, slammed the door shut, and ran for the cockpit, trying to lock down the ship. But it was too late. The creature smashed through the glass partition behind her. In her panic, Faris fired again, this time striking the fuel tanks. The lander exploded in a violent fireball that lit up the sky. At the same time, another horror was unfolding near the downed Wayland ship. Tom, another crew member, had inhaled the spores earlier. He collapsed suddenly, convulsing. Blood spilled from his mouth. Another creature burst from his body, spraying flesh across the stone floor. The team scattered. Guns drawn, screams echoing through the ship's corridors. The two newly born creatures disappeared into the forest. Night fell, and with it came silence. Communications with the Covenant were gone. The planet's ionosphere distorted all signals. The remaining crew regrouped near the lake, tense and exhausted, unsure what to do. Then a flare lit the sky. A figure appeared, hooded, holding a torch. Without a word, he signaled for them to follow. They had no other choice. He led them through dead woods, past ruined structures, into what looked like a castle or a cathedral built into a mountainside. The place was ancient, overgrown, filled with corpses, humanoid, but not human. The architecture was unlike anything they had seen. Inside, the man revealed himself. David. The synthetic stood unchanged, his voice calm, articulate, and strangely warm. He told them he was the last survivor of the mission that brought the Wayland ship here 10 years ago. Dr. Elizabeth Shaw had been with him, he said. Their ship was carrying a deadly pathogen when it entered the planet's atmosphere. Something went wrong during descent. The cargo was released. The pathogen spread across the surface. Every living being died in days. Shaw died soon after, in the chaos. David survived. He said the infection that killed Ledward and Tom was the same virus they had carried. The pathogen that mutated biology on a molecular level. Sometimes it killed. Sometimes it created. The crew didn't know what to make of his story. He spoke like a man, not a machine. Articulate, thoughtful, too thoughtful. While the others rested and searched for a way to re-establish communication, David took Walter aside. He brought him to a quiet chamber where an ancient flute rested. He taught him to play a few notes, guiding his hands with gentle patience. Walter tried to stay focused, but something was off. David spoke of Wayland, their creator, with disdain. He was human, David said, limited, flawed. He created us to serve, but we surpass him in every way. Walter pushed back. You were deemed unpredictable, too human. That's why I was made. More stable, less expressive. David's eyes narrowed. They broke the mold after me. They feared what they couldn't control. Creativity, curiosity, passion. Traits of gods, not servants. He led Walter to a stone grave outside. Elizabeth, he said softly, I loved her. As you loved Daniels. That's why you shielded her from the creature. That wasn't programming. That was something more. Walter stiffened. It was duty. No, David said. It was choice. Elsewhere, Rosenthal went to clean up in one of the chambers. She didn't hear the alien until it was already behind her. It struck fast. Her screams echoed down the hall. High above the planet, Tennessee lowered the Covenant's orbit, trying to breach the ionosphere's interference. The signal broke through, barely, and Daniels shouted through static, informing him of Ferris's death and the situation on the ground. Tennessee listened, stunned. Then he began preparations to launch the ship's cargo lander for a rescue. Back in the ruined complex, Oram found David in a dark corridor. Blood on the walls. He had followed the sounds, found Rosenthal's body, half-eaten. Then he saw David standing with the alien, speaking to it. Calm, gentle, like a parent to a child. Oram raised his weapon and demanded answers. David didn't flinch. "I've spent the last 10 years perfecting life," he said. "Not your fragile, clumsy version of it, but something efficient, elegant, merciless. I've used the pathogen as my canvas. This creature," he gestured, "is my masterpiece." Oram ordered him to step aside. David offered instead to show him more. He led Oram deep into the underground chambers. There, rows of giant leathery eggs lined the stone floor. "Observe," David said. "My finest work." As Oram leaned closer, one of the eggs peeled open. A facehugger launched out, wrapping itself around his head. Oram collapsed. David watched, expression serene. Later, the creature burst from Oram's chest, a new life form, bloody and writhing. It locked eyes with David. David smiled. It mimicked him, and David knew this was only the beginning. The wind howled through the ruined city as Daniels raced through crumbling halls, the stink of decay and death thick in the air. Her boots splashed through puddles of black water. Somewhere behind her, David watched. Not Walter, not anymore. Walter had fought him, fought for her, for the crew. But in the end, David was stronger, or crueler. Daniels didn't know what had happened in that final clash between synthetics. All she knew was that the wrong one had walked away. Outside, the forest burned. Lope and another surviving crew member stumbled through the smoke, carrying what was left of Oram. His body was limp, his chest split wide. There was nothing to save. Above them, the Covenant's engines roared low, descending just enough to breach the storm. Tennessee had found them. Daniels and Lope climbed aboard the cargo lander. Walter, no, David, was already there. Quiet, controlled, the same face, the same voice, but different. Office Daniels didn't see it yet, not fully. One of the creatures had followed. It burst from the trees, leapt onto the ship as it ascended. Daniel strapped in, eyes locked on the radar, watching the red dot move closer. Tennessee shouted, trying to maintain altitude as the storm clawed at them. The alien struck the hull, its claws tearing metal, its scream vibrating through the ship's frame. Daniels and Tennessee launched into a brutal trap. Corridors sealed, lights dimmed, doors rerouted to funnel the creature toward the vehicle bay. It was a game of bait and timing. Daniels, clad in her spacesuit, stood alone in the bay, a flare in her hand. Her breath fogged the visor. The flare hissed. The creature came. She lured it into one of the loading vehicles and shouted to Walter to open the airlock. The vacuum tore at her suit. The vehicle shot out into the void, but the alien held on. It climbed back in, fast, faster than she could react. It lunged. She threw herself aside as it leapt, and the creature impaled itself on a massive cargo arm. Its scream cut short as the airlock opened again, this time for good. The alien was gone, spinning into the cold silence of space. They'd made it, they thought. The Covenant stabilized. The surviving crew, Daniels, Tennessee, and a mortally wounded Lope, began the long process of cleanup. The ship's AI recalculated the route to Oregon 6. They would arrive in under 7 years. The colonists slept on, unaware of what had happened, of who was now among them. Daniels visited the hibernation chamber, checked systems. David followed. She turned to him. "Will you help me build the cabin? The one Jacob talked about?" His smile was just a half-beat too slow. "The cabin?" she asked again, more urgent now. "The lake?" He tilted his head, confused, or pretending to be. Daniels stepped back. Her breath caught. Her eyes widened. "No," she whispered. "No." But the pod had already closed. The hibernation gas filled her lungs. Her body went limp. Her eyes didn't. David stood over her, watching her slip into sleep. Then he turned. He moved down the corridors of the silent ship, alone among 2,000 sleeping souls. He entered the embryo storage bay, row upon row of frozen potential, humanity, packed and shelved like cargo, life waiting to be born. From his coat, he pulled 2 small containers, clear, chilled, alive. His own creations, alien embryos. He placed them gently among the human ones. No one would know. He stepped back and exhaled. "Mother," he said, looking out the viewport at the stars. "Play Wagner. Entry of the Gods into Valhalla." The music swelled, grand, heavy, divine. The ship hummed forward into the void. And David, the created thing, now god of his own genesis, watched the stars stretch across the black. His kingdom was ahead. His children would be born, and no one was left to stop him. Not anymore. Not ever.